Hello again, and welcome back to the third lecture of Week 1 of American Government and Politics. And in this one, we're going to talk a little bit about natural rights and the ideas of social contracts and where they came from, and about kind of a general shift away from the idea of absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings toward an idea of the consent of the governed. And we'll talk much more specifically about the history involved in that in the next couple of weeks. And we'll also, in this micro lecture, talk a little bit about elitism versus pluralism and about the ways that societies manage dissent. So the objectives for this, what you should be able to do by the end of this little micro lecture, is to kind of summarize the classical liberal ideas of natural rights and social contracts, to contrast elitist and pluralist views of power in American society, and to think a little bit about the strength of evidence that's offered for each of those views. So to begin, if politics is the process of deciding who gets what and how from the government, then it matters quite a bit on what principles we base our politics. We should acknowledge, though, that we are making an assumption here, that people actually do have principles for their politics beyond just maximizing their own share of the available goods and maintaining and advancing their own power to make them more effective in future allocations. So in thinking about this, leading up to the section called Who Governs, the textbook mentions the importance of minority rights. It says that, quote, people cannot be deprived of certain rights, even if an overwhelming number of people think that they should be. As we'll see in the next chapter, the founders' focus on this principle may have been partly inspired by their awareness that at some point in America's near future, they themselves might become a numerical minority who might need to be protected from the democratical majority, who might not share their priorities and interests. But for whatever reason, this focus on protecting the civil rights of minorities was a brilliant idea that prevented the tyranny of the majority that would be exercised just a few years later in the French Revolution with disastrous effects. Over 300,000 perceived enemies of the French Revolution were imprisoned, and tens of thousands were executed during the Reign of Terror. Although Britain did not experience a revolution at home like the French Revolution, the belief by British colonial leaders who thought of themselves as British subjects in America that their natural rights were being infringed by the government back in London led to the conflict that produced the United States. The language of natural rights and social contracts that the Americans used to justify their rebellion was largely developed by philosophers in Britain and France. An explosion of commerce and wealth and art and learning called the Renaissance, which means rebirth, had begun in the 15th century, the 1400s, after Europe had fully recovered from the horrors of the Black Death. And this was supercharged by the European discovery of the Americas, which not only enriched nations like Spain and Portugal, but challenged the worldviews of European thinkers. Newly discovered continents, populated by previously unknown peoples, were kind of difficult to reconcile with descriptions of the world and its origins that Europeans had been taught in school and church. Missionaries from Spain and France quickly discovered that the residents of these new continents had their own beliefs and traditions and social organizations that were often very different from those of Europe. Many accounts were published in Europe of what were called noble savages who lived without kings and decided important questions around council fires by consensus, which is much different from democracy in ways that we will talk about later in the semester. Whether or not these accounts were exaggerated, they did inspire philosophers in France and England to question the assumptions of their societies. The fundamental ideas of this new social philosophy were natural rights and a social contract. Natural rights were understood as being universal attributes of human life that existed prior to social organizations. They were not granted by an external authority, such as the church or the king, and since they were universal, they applied to all humans, regardless of their status, their location, or their group membership. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that everybody who started believing this believed it consistently. But it was an idea that started to enter people's consciousness. Governments, in this sense, were imagined as associations of people who decided that they would give up some of their natural rights in order to achieve important goals, such as safety. But the idea was that even if they had compromised on some of their rights, people still possessed them by nature. One of the most influential expressions of this idea was written by an English philosopher named John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704, and he wrote this in the 1680s. And he described a trio of rights: life, liberty, and property. And he claimed that governments were legitimate only to the extent that they protected these rights. So this social contract, this idea that governments should be judged based on how well they protected the rights of the people living under them, was a radical change from previous ideas of the divine right of kings, on which European society had been based. It didn't necessarily change the political organization of the society. Britain remained a monarchy, although after its glorious revolution of 1688, which was influenced by Locke's ideas from 1680, the king afterwards shared power with Parliament in what became known as a constitutional monarchy. In America, the rebels would later write about the consent of the governed and their right to alter or abolish governments when they became destructive of these ends. These are words from the Declaration of Independence. These two ideas, natural rights and social contracts, remain at the heart of what's called the classical liberal tradition. And I should note that liberal in this sense doesn't necessarily mean progressive, but it comes from the same root as liberty, so it's about freedom. Now, moving on, the textbook also highlights the tension between elitism and pluralism that has been present throughout American history. So let's take a look at it. This is a difference of opinion about who really makes the important decisions in American society. And one view was presented very succinctly in a book from 1956 by C. Wright Mills called The Power Elite, in which he argued that there was a relatively small group of top leaders in business and the military and government who shared similar backgrounds and worldviews. Mills claimed that this little group of elites made all the important decisions and that most Americans were powerless and were manipulated by media culture and propaganda. Now, one of the interesting points that Mills made about this power elite was that elite rule wasn't really a conspiracy. He said it didn't take formal collaboration, but rather the shared worldview and the common interests of the people at the top of what he called interlocking directorates in business and the military and government, and their shared culture of elite education and membership in exclusive clubs and social organizations allowed them to coordinate without formally conspiring. The textbook supports this with data showing the Ivy League pedigrees of recent presidents. Even Donald Trump went to Penn, which is in the Ivy League. And with the observation that nearly all members of Congress and the Senate are college educated, in comparison with just over a third of Americans having even an associate's degree. But is this conclusive evidence of elitism? Government in America is largely about making laws. So most legislators have law degrees. Doesn't that make sense? Wouldn't we prefer to have educated people debating these issues on our behalf? Do we really want to send people to represent us in Washington who haven't studied the issues or who can't understand them? Are we really saying that more educated people are different in some essential way that prevents them from sharing the concerns of less educated people? We should think about that. A bigger issue, and one that Americans really don't like to talk about that much, might be social class. Nearly 2/3 of all the members of the U.S. Congress are millionaires, and about 3/4 of the senators. And many of them didn't just get this wealth by insider trading once they got there. Many of them come from families that have enjoyed generational wealth for decades or generations, sometimes even centuries. And this may be closer to what Mills was really arguing. Trust fund Nepo babies meeting each other in frat houses at Harvard and Yale probably do have a different perspective on the problems facing Americans and possible solutions to those problems than folks who regularly work for their livings. If they end up running the government, that might indeed present a problem. To counter this possibility, the textbook also describes several examples of successful pluralism, when regular people have been able to organize effectively to move the needle and to get the change that they were looking for. And the textbook wants to use this to support the idea that we should all engage in our democracy and maybe even join a political cause. And this may be good advice, and we'll discuss that in more detail in later chapters. In the meantime, there's another possible source of optimism. In the 2010s, the Harvard political scientist Erica Chenoweth developed what she called the 3.5% rule of effective nonviolent resistance. After she researched hundreds of movements throughout the world between 1900 and 2006, Chenoweth concluded that no government has been able to withstand a challenge when 3.5% or more of the population actively participated in mass protests or strikes or civil disobedience. She also found that nonviolent campaigns have historically been twice as effective as violent ones. So that's hopeful. So to conclude, as we continue through the semester, these types of questions will continue to be relevant. Who rules? For whom do they rule? How do Americans perceive their government? And how has this changed over time? What effect do the layers of local, state, and national politics have on the ways that we understand and participate in our government? Next week, specifically, we'll turn to some of the specific historical events that shaped the institutions that were developed in the early American Republic. So I'm looking forward to getting to that with you. But that's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.